Welcome to The Debate. Today, we are examining one of the most powerful and, frankly, often weaponized words in our language: ignorance. We're tracing its really profound semantic transformation, its path from, a neutral description of merely not knowing to what we often see today as a devastating character assassination. The core of our discussion, framed by the source material we're looking at, is essentially this. Did the Enlightenment era shift, which started defining ignorance as a choice and therefore a moral failing, did that fundamentally improve intellectual accountability, civic health, or conversely, did this linguistic process, this pejoration, did it primarily create a sort of judgmental and exclusionary environment that actually stifles genuine intellectual inquiry and maybe even fosters intellectual hubris?
Right.
So I'll be arguing that this negative shift was a necessary reflection of increased information access and is absolutely vital for condemning willful and, yes, privileged forms of ignorance in modern society.
And I come at it from a slightly different angle. I believe that this profound negative shift unjustly pathologizes what is really a natural and necessary human state, the simple absence of knowing. And in doing so, it's resulted in this persistent and, I think, damaging paradox of the educated fool. We really need to question whether using this word as an insult actually leads to greater wisdom, or if it just encourages, greater pretense.
Okay, I see why you'd advocate for that kind of intellectual charity. But let me try and ground my position. In the historical context, the necessity of it. The highly negative connotation we now attach to the term is, I think, entirely justified by the seismic societal shifts that took place during the Enlightenment, roughly, 1685 to 1815. Before that period, knowledge was often locked away, right? Controlled by elites, the aristocracy, religious institutions. If you were ignorant, it was probably inevitable.
Largely, yes.
But then technology intervened. The proliferation of the printing press meant that by the early 18th century, we had over 20 million books in circulation. Knowledge was really, for the first time in history, becoming increasingly accessible to the general population. You had rising literacy, public education initiatives starting up.
Right. The access changed dramatically.
Exactly. And this accessibility radically altered the societal expectation. Ignorance was no longer seen as some unavoidable fate. It became, as Immanuel Kant so powerfully framed it, mankind's exit from self-imposed immaturity, a failure to use one's own understanding without needing guidance from someone else. So the modern negative usage, I argue, correctly identifies willful ignorance, where an individual actively chooses to avoid information that is actually readily available.
Okay.
And this isn't just theory. We have empirical evidence of people making this conscious choice today. Look at the Pew Research statistics showing that really a striking 44% of Americans admit to actively avoiding news that contradicts their existing beliefs. This distinction between, passive lack and willful refusal, it's essential for ethical discourse, for civic responsibility. And legal systems recognize this need for accountability centuries ago through principles like ignorance iuris non exequat, ignorance of the law excuses not, acknowledging that not knowing, at least in certain contexts, carries an inescapable responsibility.
That's a very compelling historical and legal argument for accountability, I grant you that. But it seems to potentially conflate civic duty with maybe cognitive reality. I think we need to look at the conceptual harm caused by taking what was a neutral state and turning it into a kind of moral indictment. The origin of the word is key here, I think. The Latin root ignorate meant simply to not know. It stems from the Indo-European root gno, which is the source of so many of our fundamental words about recognition, understanding like know, agnostic, recognize. It was simply the neutral starting condition of the human mind.
Okay.
So, if you treat ignorance as a character flaw rather than a neutral state or just a starting point, you replace that natural human impulse of curiosity with shame. And that's why, medieval universities actually viewed ignorance as the natural starting condition for learning. You weren't shamed for what you lacked. That was the entire purpose of being there. The problem with this negative shift, this pejoration, this linguistic darkening of the word's meaning, is that it has made the term a weapon, a tool for the categorical dismissal of others in public forums, rather than seeing it as a trigger for maybe educational opportunities. And this intense judgment fosters precisely the educated fool paradox that concerns me. We're talking about someone with ample formal education or just vast information abundance. I mean, apparently we consume an average of 34 gigabytes of data every single day, who nonetheless just locks down their intellectual defenses, lacks humility, and remains completely closed to new ideas. This shows that the massive increase in access hasn't automatically solved the moral problem of intellectual stagnation. The missing ingredient seems to be intellectual virtue, not just the volume of facts.
Okay, let's dig deeper into that Enlightenment framing of choice, because I believe that shift was a critical step in democratizing knowledge and, crucially, accountability. Yes, the availability of knowledge increased, but maybe more importantly, the rise of public education and literacy fundamentally changed the contract, you could say, between the individual and society. Not knowing, in many situations, became reasonably associated with moral laziness, perhaps, or a failure of the civic duty to stay informed.
A failure of duty. Okay.
And this moral weight is, I think, absolutely essential when confronting what I'd call privileged ignorance, the luxury of actively ignoring complex social, economic, or environmental problems simply because they don't personally affect you, even while you might continue to benefit from the systems that perpetuate them. If we strip the word ignorance of its judgmental connotation, we lose a moral language necessary to challenge this deliberate avoidance. That principle of ignorantia juris is about the contract of citizenship, right? You can't just claim not to know the basics of the system you benefit from.
I find the distinction between passive ignorance and privileged ignorance useful. I do. But focusing solely on choice seems to overlook a profound cognitive reality that perhaps the Enlightenment thinkers didn't fully appreciate: confirmation bias. Our brains aren't just passive recipients of facts, they are filtering mechanisms. We naturally seek information that confirms what we already believe, and we filter out or explain away evidence that contradicts it. This is a cognitive shortcut. It's kind of built into the brain's architecture.
Sure, it's a known bias.
Exactly. So, shaming this psychological tendency doesn't fix it. It just makes people defensive. It drives them further toward selective information exposure. It reinforces echo chambers instead of actually developing genuine critical thinking skills. You can load someone up with facts, sure, but if they lack the internal wisdom and, crucially, the intellectual humility to challenge their own mental filters, they'll simply use those facts to bolster their existing biases. The issue isn't just the access to facts. We are, as I said, practically drowning in them, but the wisdom and the humility required to interpret them critically.
But surely we must still maintain a standard of responsibility despite cognitive bias. I mean, acknowledging that our brains have defaults doesn't absolve us of the responsibility to actively engage our critical faculties, does it? The moral weight assigned to ignorance, I'd argue, serves as a crucial societal pressure point. It encourages us to seek out those contradictory viewpoints, to actively combat our natural inclination toward confirmation bias. If we lower that bar, we're essentially saying that failing to make that intellectual effort is socially acceptable.
The negative connotation today serves as a marker for the expected standard of modern citizenship. We are required, I think, to try and overcome cognitive defaults when those defaults result in harm to others or just poor civic participation. The existence of confirmation bias actually makes the critique of willful ignorance more necessary, not less. Well, that brings us directly to how devastatingly the word is actually used in practice today, when the term ignorant is, as the source notes, hurled as one of the most devastating character assassinations in public debate, particularly online, right? Discussing highly complex issues like climate science or nuanced cultural history. The crucial nuance between passive unknowing, just a temporary state, and willful refusal, a chosen, sustained stance, is completely lost.
Okay, the nuance can be lost in the heat of argument, yes.
It's more than that, though. This heavy moral judgment is detrimental. When someone genuinely lacks the background knowledge to engage a complex topic, calling them ignorant instantly treats that knowledge gap as some kind of unforgivable transgression. It becomes a tool for categorical dismissal. It shuts down debate, it prevents the necessary educational opportunity. Instead of clarifying the facts, it just solidifies ideological trenches. It allows the informed person to stand there in a place of, frankly, self-satisfied superiority. The sheer social cost of the label prevents people from admitting the gaps in their knowledge in the first place.
I find that the charged accusation is absolutely necessary today, precisely because passive ignorance does so quickly become willful in an information-rich environment like ours. I understand the concern about nuance being lost, I really do, but if we return to a purely neutral definition, we lose the moral leverage needed to challenge people who intentionally ignore facts to maintain comfortable or profitable or maybe just ideologically convenient beliefs.
But is leverage the right tool here?
Well, the neutral definition of ignorance, a simple lack of knowledge, that's useful for a dictionary, fine. But its common negative connotation in society serves a critical function, highlighting the responsibility that knowledge now carries. If information is readily available and you refuse to internalize it or act on it, that is a failure of civic and intellectual responsibility, and the term must reflect that reality. Without that judgmental language, there's really no consequence for intellectual dereliction.
But does that consequence actually achieve the goal of, knowledge? We keep discussing the educated fool, right? Someone who has successfully navigated the formal education system, maybe holds advanced degrees, yet remains utterly closed to new ideas. This person embodies the failure of that Enlightenment promise. They have the facts, perhaps, but they lack intellectual humility. They are products of a system, I'd argue, that prioritizes the appearance of knowing everything over the actual virtue of recognizing one's limitations. The reason they are fools is often because they are so certain. And that certainty is encouraged, I think, by a culture where admitting ignorance means facing devastation. If the modern semantic shift punishes the honest admission of a lack of knowledge, then it actively promotes the kind of brittle, closed-minded intellectualism we see in the educated fool.
Okay, I agree that the educated fool exists, absolutely. But I would argue that this individual is a failure of application and intellectual habit, not a failure of the linguistic shift of the word ignorance itself. The solution isn't to, neuter the word, which has a vital function. It's to promote specific, tangible intellectual habits, habits that the source material actually highlights. Things like curiosity over certainty, the critical evaluation of sources, and the active exposure to diverse viewpoints.
But how does the negative term encourage those habits?
Because if we make willful ignorance a zero-cost option, linguistically speaking, we reduce the incentive for people to actively cultivate these difficult intellectual habits. The social cost associated with the label ignorant, precisely because it is uncomfortable, serves as a powerful motivator for individuals to demonstrate that they are actively engaging with complexity and knowledge. It thereby promotes those exact habits of critical engagement you seek. The semantic shift is a tool for setting the standard, for raising the bar.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that fear is the pathway to wisdom. What truly separates genuine knowledge from the closed-mindedness of the educated fool is intellectual humility, that acute, Socratic awareness of what we don't know. The current cultural use of ignorance, precisely because it is so devastating, encourages false certainty and intellectual hubris. People prioritize appearing informed and knowledgeable because they desperately fear being labeled. They're driven by performance, not by genuine curiosity.
Performance over curiosity.
Exactly. The most profound wisdom, I believe, begins with acknowledging the vastness of our own ignorance. That's the necessary starting point for learning. The modern judgmental use of the word actively suppresses that fundamental Socratic concept through shame and categorical dismissal. It treats ignorance like a terminal disease instead of the natural precondition for growth.
Okay, so to summarize my perspective, the evolution of ignorance into a term of judgment was a necessary linguistic process. It reflected the Enlightenment principle that access to knowledge demands active intellectual engagement. This pejoration serves a vital function in challenging that self-imposed immaturity, that willful refusal to learn, and ultimately I think it raises the bar for civic and intellectual accountability in our information-rich world. And while I fundamentally agree that the types of ignorance, passive versus willful, absolutely must be distinguished, I maintain that the severe moral weight now placed upon the word has badly eroded intellectual humility. It has made ignorant a destructive tool for dismissal rather than education, ironically complicating the path toward genuine, self-aware wisdom for all those who understandably fear being targeted by that devastating label.
The journey of the single word really demonstrates how deeply our relationship with knowledge is interwoven with our social expectations, our moral values, particularly when knowledge itself becomes so abundant, almost a commodity.
It certainly leaves us and the audience to consider that necessary and perhaps precarious balance between individual intellectual freedom and the weighty civic responsibility demanded by the modern information age.